Today, we are in the forward cargo hold of the SS Great Britain, a rare opportunity to come to this area of the ship which is not open to the general public. Most of the vessel has been lovingly restored, but this area is pretty much the same as she was when she returned to Bristol 50 years ago. The hold contains many interesting features, including the mast step, basically a mortise cut into the vessel to hold the bottom of the mast. You can see by the size of this mast step that the masts of the SS Great Britain were indeed impressive, and this would have been one of the smaller of her masts. And so what better place for us to be to introduce our topic for this session, which is conservation. My name is Mike Haigh. I'm the project director of a new venture based in the Caribbean called Wreck Hunters, where we aim to teach the skills and techniques of diving archaeology in warm, clear waters on a tiny island called Utila, focused on the remains of an 18th century wreck, which we call the Oliver. As a prelude to that, I'm running a series of sessions which cover areas that diving archaeologists deal with on a regular basis. And in this session, we're going to talk about wreck conservation. Even during their working lives, boats and ships require maintenance. Wooden structures, sails, ropes, and metal parts of the ship all require work if they are not to rot. Eventually, painting or some other form of covering will not work, and then these items have to be replaced. This is often called restoration. It is a commonly held myth that keeping artifacts wet will preserve them. This is simply not true, unless the watery environment in which these objects are placed has been itself chemically altered. Even here, on this Great Britain, parts of the deck and spars have had to be replaced because of weathering. Now, if this is just for display, it's only a matter of cost. But for further research and indoor exhibition, preservation, or what we call conservation, is required. And who better to talk about this very subject than Nicola Grahamshaw, the conservation engineer of the SS Great Britain. So Nicola, we're here in the riggers yard of the SS Great Britain to talk about conservation. First question, Nicola, what does conservation mean to you in terms of historic wrecks?
So when you're conserving a historic vessel, the aim of conservation is to retain whatever it is about that vessel that makes it significant. So whatever it is that makes it special. And when it comes to kind of the practical details, that can encompass a whole variety of different activities. So it can be keeping a vessel afloat, it can be preserving the original material, it can be reconstruction, restoration, or it can just be creating a record of a vessel, which then potentially in the future could be used for a replica.
So as we can't conserve all the wrecks because we haven't got enough money to do that, what is the criteria that we use in order to justify conserving some wrecks and not others?
We would always recommend using the guidelines set out by National Historic Ships, and they publish a book, and there's also some information on their website, including a handy flowchart which kind of guides you through the decision-making process. So related to what I've said previously about retaining significance, all vessels are unique, no two are quite the same, and so the conservation of any particular vessel needs to be tailored to its condition and its significance.
So what approach have you used with the SS Great Britain and why?
Well, the SS Great Britain is significant for a number of reasons, but one of the most important things about her is the fact that she was the world's first metal ship. So the material and the structure is a really, it's not the only thing that makes her significant, but it's a really important part of what makes her significant. So our conservation strategy is centred around preserving that original material. And the way we do that is by creating a seal around the most vulnerable parts of the metal, and then we have a pair of dehumidifiers which keep the air around the iron as dry as the Arizona desert. And by doing that, we can stop it from corroding.
So the story of the SS Great Britain's resurrection starts with the recovery from the Falklands, and of course the whole story behind Isambard, Kingdom and Brunel is one of our greatest engineers. How important was Brunel's name in getting the ship back to Bristol?
The salvage of the ship was initiated by a naval architect, and actually his interest in the ship was the ship as the first iron ship and as the first propeller ship. However, when it came to kind of garnering support, the Brunel link proved to be quite important. And some of the early supporters of the salvage were Brunel enthusiasts. And then as the trust has developed, the role of Brunel has become more and more important. We first started doing exhibitions on him in the 80s. And then when the big restoration project was happening, the one requiring lots and lots of fundraising, fortunately for us, at the same time, the BBC were running their Greatest Britons poll, I'm not sure whether you remember that, and had Jeremy Clarkson kind of championing Brunel as his pick, and Brunel came second. So that raised a lot of awareness, and that was a really big boost for us. And today we actually hold a couple of the most significant Brunel collections, and we try and use Brunel's legacy to inspire what we do here. So today he's a really central part of what we do.
So could you expand a little bit on this, Great Britain, in terms of her importance in maritime engineering?
Well, she was the second ship from the Great Western Steamship Company. She was the largest ship ever seen or ever conceived, which at the time was a big achievement. She was also the first ocean ship to be made from iron or any metal. And then partway through the construction, Brunel found this idea of using a screw propeller instead of the paddle wheels, and he actually paused construction of the ship while he persuaded the directors of the company to let him use this new technology, or to fund this new technology for driving the ship. So it's two big technological milestones in one ship. And the other thing about the iron is that the fact that she was made from iron is the only reason why she's able to last as long as she did. And even before being scuttled and salvaged, she had a 94-year working career, which is pretty impressive for a ship at that time.
So to what extent is the restoration of the SS Great Britain the restoration of a national treasure?
Well, the name SS Great Britain certainly attracted the interest of a couple of the really key people who were involved in the salvage, both volunteers and funders, who had in fact never heard of the ship before, but thought, well, she must be really special to have earned that name, and so that was kind of what got them on board with the project. But in terms of her significance, she is actually internationally significant. She was the first in the world to do the things that she did.
The ship has been restored to a very high level, and she looks great today. So how do you reconcile the use of replicas as part of the ship's image, as well as pure preservation of artefacts?
There are various different approaches to conserving a vessel, and it's all about retaining significance. And the purpose of replicas is to capture or to kind of put a record into kind of being again in a case where either the original doesn't exist anymore, or where it's not practical to keep the original material intact. So with the SS Great Britain, because she had such a long and interesting working life, so she was reconfigured many times. So by the time she was scuttled, and certainly by the time she came back to Bristol, she was a hulk. So she didn't have any of her original interior. So we didn't have the option of preserving any of that. So our preservation extends to the parts of the original iron which are left. So that's the hull and the kind of internal structure, which I know you've just been and seen. But the interior is entirely reconstructed, but we've tried to do that in as authentic a way as possible. So every detail of that reconstruction is informed by factual information that we've got in our collection. So for example, letters written by passengers on board, or diaries, or paintings, or sketches from our collection. So we've tried to be as authentic as possible with that.
So in terms of restoration, as we call it, what high standards have been kept to ensure that restoration is the standard that it should be?
Well, one of the National Historic Ships guidelines, one of the principles that those guidelines are based on, is that everything should be planned and carried out in a logical order, and that you should resist the temptation to firefight or to run around after whatever seems most urgent at the time. And in the case of the SS Great Britain, that was actually quite a big change of direction. So the initial application for lottery funding was rejected, and what the lottery did instead was to employ a curator to do just that, to step back, to think it through, to plan it out logically, even though the ship was degrading during all that time, because in the long run, that's the better thing to do. So that having a curator leading the project meant everything could be done to a high standard, and that's what we've tried to do.
How important was the work of volunteer divers in terms of wreck preservation, and particularly in the story of the SS Great Britain?
Well, in the salvage of the SS Great Britain, the divers played a really key role. So there were two, well, there were many things they had to do, but there were two key things they had to do. Firstly, because she'd been scuttled, but she'd actually been sitting there for a great number of years. So there were a few kind of key structural things which the divers had to sort out before they could get the ship afloat. So there were the scuttling holes themselves, of course, but there was also a large crack in the starboard side of the ship where she'd been subjected to hogging. Through all the time that she'd had the tides washing the sand away from underneath her. And the way that problem was solved was by putting out an appeal on the local radio for the locals to donate any unwanted old mattresses, which the divers then used to repair that crack in the side of the ship so that she could be refloated. Now, the divers on the SS Great Britain were actually professionals rather than volunteers. However, the story of the ship includes loads and loads of volunteers in a whole variety of different roles. So right up from the initial salvage right up until today, we rely very heavily on volunteers.
What can wreck conservation tell us about the past as it relates to future generations?
In terms of all the information we've got in our collection, we are always discovering new stories and new details about life on board, about who some of the passengers are, who we perhaps didn't realise before, and always uncovering these stories. And one of the things that we try to do as a trust and as a visitor attraction is we try and have something, we try and make ourselves relevant to any visitor, and in particular our younger audiences. And we really pride ourselves on finding something that everyone can relate to in amongst all of our stories. And hopefully with Brunel's legacy, we're hoping to inspire the engineers of the future as well.
If you could sum up the main achievements of the SS Great Britain as a conservation project, what would you say they would be?
Well, the SS Great Britain in the first place is a ship of international significance. She was the first of her kind. She was the first ever iron ocean-going vessel. She was the first propeller-driven ocean-going vessel. She was the largest ship in the world at the time. So she was really the common ancestor, or we call her the great-grandmother of all modern ships. So most modern ships today have those two things. They're made from metal and they have screw propellers, which are actually pretty similar to the one that Brunel designed. So that's the kind of original achievements of the ship. But also the conservation of the SS Great Britain was the first large historic ship conservation project of this kind. So that was a first in terms of the lottery funding and the kind of curatorial approach and stuff. So it was, and certainly the first in terms of having two giant dehumidifiers.
And finally, Nicola, I know there's one question a lot of people do ask. Could she ever sail again?
Could the SS Great Britain ever sail again? Well, in theory, any ship or any wreck could be made to sail again if you did enough repairs and if you added enough material. But with the SS Great Britain, we've already established that what makes her significant is her original material. So we could make her sail again, but in doing so, you have to ask yourself, would she still be the SS Great Britain?
So Nicola, thank you for shedding so much light on so many different aspects of conservation and preservation of the SS Great Britain as an example of a wreck for us, and I wish you all the best for your future work.
Thank you for having me.
Having had a thorough look at conservation, next time we'll be looking at the future for wreck hunters, and indeed the future for those interested in diving archaeology. Until then, I wish you all safe and enjoyable diving.